Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation by Joe, difficult to follow. Could we have the lights off, please? What I will try to do is to give you the highlights of our most recent field work at Gordion during the past summer, where we worked for about 2 months. And as Julian said, I've had the good fortune to be co-director of Gordion since 2007, but this was my first summer as director. So I tried to do perhaps more than we should have done, but it was a tremendously productive summer for all of us. I should also say that when I became co-director of Gordion, the first thing I did was to stop excavation. Excavation had been going on for, since 1950, really. It was one of the early projects of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And the problem that archaeologists run into is that it's fun to discover things. It's not so much fun to publish the things that you've discovered. So archaeologists don't always have a great reputation for speedy publication. So I didn't want to excavate any more than we already had until the pace of publication increased. And over the last 3 years, we've published 6 monographs on work at Gordion. And so I felt this summer that we had reached a point where excavation could begin again. And that's what I want to talk to you about, the recent excavation in tandem with our conservation. First, let me situate Gordion in time and space for you. We're dealing with a site in the middle of Turkey, about an hour's drive southwest of Ankara, located on the 3rd longest river in Turkey, right after the Kızıl Irmak and the Yeşil Irmak, all of which empty into the Black Sea. Although we think of it as a site that's famous only for having had Midas as one of its kings, or for having had a Gordian knot that was cut by Alexander the Great in 333 BC, at the period of its greatest prominence during the Iron Age, between the 10th and the 7th centuries BC, it controlled much of what we would now label Central Turkey, Central Asia Minor. So one of the great powers of the Iron Age in the Near East. And some of the monuments associated with that period of power we were lucky enough to find. The Mound of Gordion itself is... And here's Rodney Young. The Mound of Gordion itself contains settlements that span a period of about 4,000 years, which is nearly the same as what we have at Troy, where I've also been lucky enough to work for the last 25 years. But a period of time roughly from 2500 BC to the 14th century AD. And much of this material was revealed by Rodney Young, the first of the major excavators at Gordion, who dug here between 1950 and the time of his untimely death in 1974. He was curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the museum and really one of the pioneering forces in the study of Mediterranean and Near Eastern archaeology at Penn. This was a period, in a sense, where archaeologists tended to look like cowboys, as you will already have noticed. And you will, of course, have noticed that Joe and I look very different from the kind of stance that Rodney Young is cutting here. When Gordion was first founded, it was really a very small settlement in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. It's not really until the so-called Phrygian period, between the 10th century and the beginning of the Hellenistic period, that a major campaign of building occurred on the mound, on the citadel mound that constitutes the center of the Phrygian kingdom. And you're seeing an aerial view of the citadel mound here, and you can see the extent of the material or the extent of the territory that's been excavated by Rodney Young, or was excavated by Rodney Young over time. And then a color phase plan that shows all the walls, buildings, streets, monuments that were built at Gordion during the entire history of its habitation. So, in essence, from the 10th century through the Hellenistic period. And this plan was just done by Gabriel Pizzorno and Gareth Derbyshire, 2 of our great digital resource researchers at Gordion. And so you get an idea of how complex a site it is, how complex the history of buildings are as we move from early Phrygian to Middle Phrygian to late Phrygian, and again from the 10th century through the 4th century. One of the great questions that we had was how the citadel was laid out. Not just the citadel, but the area around it. What were the streets like? What were the traffic patterns like? There had been a little excavation in the 1950s and 60s that suggested that there was a major street running through the center of the Citadel Mound, which I've drawn in for you on the aerial view as well as on the color phase plan. And what I wanted to do was to test that, to see if we could find the evidence for the street and to see whether or not we could find any evidence for a gate that would have been located at the beginning of that street. Before I go into the excavations themselves, I want to say a little about the early Phrygian period, because our finds, in essence, date to the early Phrygian period. And again, that's the 10th and 9th centuries BC. We have a great deal surviving from the early Phrygian period, thanks to the campaigns of Rodney Young. And many of these discoveries that Rodney Young made are among the first Pebble Mosaic that we know of anywhere in the ancient world. And you see a watercolor of that Pebble Mosaic here. It looks almost as if you have a series of small carpets turned in slightly different directions, but comprising the entire floor of a building that was not much smaller than this auditorium. We also have the best preserved citadel gateway of the Iron Age in Asia Minor, the so-called early Phrygian gateway, which you see in actuality on the left and in a recent reconstruction by Gabe Pizzorno and Gareth Derbyshire at the right. When I began to formulate a plan for fieldwork at the site, I realized that the first thing I had to do was an extensive campaign of remote sensing. That's to say, magnetic prospection, radar, and electric resistivity. Those are the three main types of remote sensing that archaeologists tend to use today. So I was fortunate in being able to secure the services of Stefan Giese and Christian Hubner from Freiburg in southwest Germany. They had done all of my remote sensing at Troy, and so I simply brought them to Gordion, where no significant remote sensing had occurred. There had been a little in the middle of the 1960s, but only a very little. And of course, some of these techniques were in their infancy at that point. So you're seeing, again, the aerial view of the Citadel Mound, and then with the magnetic results, or the results from the magnetic prospection superimposed on top of it. What this did was to give us the organization of the residential district of Gordion. And it's very difficult, probably given where you are now, to make out the details on this plan. And also this projector tends to make the images a little fuzzy. But we were able to identify the streets, the buildings, and the outer fortifications, which you see in red. So identifying which areas are most potentially productive for excavation. In a sense, it takes the guesswork out of digging. And although radar doesn't work especially well in the area of Gordion, magnetic prospection does, where you use a machine that looks like this. You walk along along a line within a particular area, and that will measure, the machine will measure variations in the magnetic fields of buried objects. And once you print that out, it's almost as if you've gotten an X-ray of the buildings, the features that lie beneath the surface of the earth. When I conceived of the idea, and I really have to credit Charles Williams with this idea, when I suppose the team conceived of the idea with Charles Williams of exploring this area at the entrance to the street, the southeast, the beginning of the street, we realized that this was not going to be an easy area to explore or to dig, because this was an area where Rodney Young had placed an enormous dump. In general, the areas that are most interesting for us to dig are the places where our predecessors put their biggest dumps. Not just average dumps, the biggest dumps. So I remember at Troy when we wanted to try to find the late Bronze Age archive to the north of the Citadel Mound. We were all excited about it, but that was where Heinrich Schliemann had placed his biggest, the absolute biggest dump of many big dumps. And so it's very difficult to do this. We needed to bring in a bulldozer, and even after we had taken away the dump, we were left with a difficult area to explore because it was at a 45-degree angle. We're on the slope of the mound, the southeast slope of the mound right here. Nevertheless, the remote sensing people were able to handle this without any serious difficulty. Magnetic prospection yielded some very interesting results, as did electric resistivity, where you're shooting electric impulses into the earth, and some of the subsurface features will be resistant to electricity or non-resistant to electricity. So clay is not so resistant to electricity, but limestone is. And you're able, again, as with magnetic perspection, to determine the location of subsurface features. And we thought what we located here and here was a gateway positioned at the entrance to the street. But of course we needed to dig it to find out. And that was our primary area of investigation this past summer. The place where we were digging, the entrance to the street, was adjacent to another building that had been uncovered by Rodney Young, the so-called Mosaic building. You see this elaborately patterned mosaic that decorated the floors. This was a building that probably served as the headquarters for the administrator of Gordion during the period of Persian control. So that would be the later 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BC. And our hope was that we would find material from this mosaic building that had been thrown down onto the street in the area where we were digging. So we began the trench, and this, as I say, was not an easy trench to dig because you can see the incline. It was also filled, and you can see it just at the very beginning of work here. It was filled to the brim with stones and with a building collapse. So you're seeing here the very beginning of digging where we had a big stone collapse up here, a large wall here, which turned out to be a stepped, cut stone stepped retaining wall or glacis, more stones here, and a whole conglomeration of stones here that seem to have come down in an earthquake around 400 BC. And you're seeing some of the wood that was contained within that earthquake collapse on the right, which we have now sent to Cornell to the dendrochronology lab, and we hope that we'll get some dates from them very soon. But as we continued digging down, we found more and more of this so-called glacis, 13 steps of the glacis. This, again, a cut stone terrace wall or retaining wall, and then another wall built above it, and then more stones from yet another building on top of it. You're seeing here a side view of this glacis, and here the stone wall that's been built on top of it. It's likely from our investigations, we think we can tell, that the glacis went down another 4 or 5 meters. So what we're dealing with is a major complex that's over 10 meters high, consisting not just of the retaining wall, but also of a monumental structure on top of it, and another monumental structure behind it. The existence of a glacis was not a surprise to us. We have a well-preserved glacis on the eastern side of the mound. This one, however, is of Middle Phrygian date, of the 8th century, and this one is at least a century earlier. It seems to be of early Phrygian date, so 9th century BC, the earliest glacis that has yet been uncovered in Asia Minor. So one has to imagine what it would have been like as one approached the citadel of Gordion, this giant citadel framed by an equally giant retaining wall of cut stone. No other settlement in Iron Age Anatolia had such a thing. And it became increasingly elaborate as time went by, with color introduced into the retaining wall, different colored stones, once the Middle Phrygian period started in the 8th century BC. As I said, we have tumbled stones from a structure even more monumental further to the north, and you can see that in the magnetic perspection of the area. This is a little difficult to read, but the white area is stone. So we have an equally giant building behind the glacis. Whether or not it has anything to do with the gate, this purported gate, we're not certain. But our excavations will move further to the north to try to uncover some of this giant structure that the stones of which we began to uncover this past summer. These are giant polychromatic stones, so whatever the building was, it was monumental. We try to balance what we do in excavation with conservation. The Republic of Turkey asks us to spend, ideally, 75% of our time on conservation and restoration, and only a smaller part on excavation. One of the problems with earlier archaeologists, this is true all over the world, is that As I've said, it's fun to discover things. It's less fun to publish them, and it's less fun to conserve them because there's no glory associated with that. So what you find with the earlier archaeologists is that they uncovered buildings wildly and then went somewhere else without securing the foundations of the building. And so, of course, many of these buildings are now in danger of collapsing. And so we're following behind the excavations of Rodney Young, trying to solidify what it was he excavated. And that includes this large terrace building, an industrial district of early Phrygian Gordion, 10th and 9th centuries BC, within the actual citadel. You see it here in plan and here in aerial view. And those walls have been one of our biggest problems over time because they're simply so fragile. They were destroyed in a major fire around 800 BC, and the walls are falling to the side, so they're splayed. One side tilting to the left, one side tilting to the right. So the first thing we have to do is to put the stones together again. As you see our conservators, Angelo Lanza and his assistant, as well as Elisa Del Bono, doing it upper right. Here are the walls themselves on which we're working. So we take the walls apart, at least those walls where the stones have been badly cracked by the fire of 800 BC, and slowly put them back together again, reassembling them in the walls, and then also inserting steel cables in the walls that hold the two sides together so that we won't, at least for another half century, have to worry about this again. What we do when we finish conserving the walls is to put on top of them something we call the Softcap. In the old days, archaeologists put concrete on the tops of their walls. That would keep it in place. Sort of like going along with this cowboy spirit. Let's just pour concrete on the walls and they'll be stable forever. But that doesn't work because these are areas of extreme temperatures. And concrete will crack as the temperature gets hotter and then gets colder. And so once the concrete cracks, the water gets in during the rainy season, but then it can't get out. So it will push the masonry to the side and destroy the wall. What we conceived of, and this is really the brainchild of Frank Matero, professor of historic preservation at Penn, in tandem with Naomi Miller, a research scientist here, was to frame the top of the wall with mud brick and then fill it with earth in which is growing shallow-rooted plants called poa. What this means is that when the water comes, the roots of the plants will absorb the water, but the roots never go down deep enough to penetrate into the masonry and push out the stones. So it enables the wall to breathe, as it were, and it's a much healthier solution than the concrete that had been used in the past. We also began work on the Pebble Mosaic that I mentioned to you before, this 9th century Pebble Mosaic from one of the elite buildings of the Citadel, which also ranks as the oldest stone mosaic in the world. You see it here as it was discovered by Rodney Young in the 1950s, and here before we started work on it. It was set in concrete and it wasn't taken care of, and so now it's falling apart. So we had to redo it, and we began to do that toward the end of the summer. You see our conservator, Angelo Lanza, had to break off some of the concrete around the mosaic so that we could take it up again and reset it in a better setting so that it wouldn't be as prone to cracking as had been the case before. And Isham Kilinch, another historic preservation person from Penn, is in the process of taking up the Pebble Mosaic and resetting it. I should say that 4 of these Pebble Mosaics will actually come to Penn in 2016 when we're having a major Gordion exhibit. We've also had to deal with the Iron Age city gate, which you see here from the air. This, again, is our best preserved citadel gate from the Iron Age in Anatolia. We've already put a soft cap on this side of the wall. This one still has the original concrete cap. And one of the problems with this wall is that the water has gotten in and it has pushed out the masonry. So if you were standing there, you would see that these stones are about to fall out. And so the conservators are just beginning to start work on the gate there and over here. What they're going to have to do is actually take out the stones, cut back the mortar, or cut back the stone fill behind it, and then reset it. And we've also done some excavation this past summer around the foundations to make sure that no water is getting into the stones of the foundations, because of course that would provide additional weakness for the wall. But slowly we're able to move forward with this, and I should thank the J.M. Kaplan Fund for a very generous 3-year grant that's enabling us to fix this early Phrygian gateway. One of the big problems of Gordion for tourists is that the terrain is very uneven. It's not easy to get around. There weren't any stone staircases, or at least those that existed were badly damaged and difficult to walk. It was almost, people would walk around the stone staircases on the earth. That's how bad the staircases were. So we decided to really fix up the tourist path this summer, quarrying stone from the nearby quarries and gradually setting in a whole new network of stone paths so it would be a much easier route for the visitors around the mound. So you can see, again, in aerial view, the new stone staircases in the upper shot as well as in the lower. So I wouldn't say it's handicapped accessible by any means, but it's a lot easier now to get around than it ever was before. And we also have tried to fix the fences and the signage. I think I don't have to say anything if you look at the upper left, barbed wire surrounding the site, and a sign that looks sort of 1950s vintage and badly rusted. So we've taken down the barbed wire, created a new network of fences made of wire and steel, and put up 11 new information signs, bilingual information signs that make it very easy for any visitor to understand the complex history of Gordion with maps, plans, and even remote sensing images, so that people will understand exactly what we're doing. And we've also included a great deal about architectural conservation, since that is one of the components of our identity now. We have not neglected additional remote sensing. Here you're seeing the Citadel Mound of Gordion, where we do most of our work. These are the outer fortifications that we've been able to discover and to reconstruct, courtesy of magnetic perspection. And then this summer, we moved to the so-called outer town, a residential district that was very badly understood. And we found that the outer town was also fortified with an enormous defensive ditch set in front of it, about 4 to 5 meters wide, which is even larger than the defensive ditches at Troy. So gradually, remote sensing is telling us an enormous amount about the defensive system of the city. We also try to work in tandem with the Archaeological Museum in Ankara whenever they ask for our assistance. And they often ask for our assistance vis-a-vis burial mounds, these giant burial mounds or tumuli that are plundered with great regularity. Joe was talking about the threat of plunder, and it's a problem for us as well. This was especially the case with the Bejes tumulus, which is about 15 kilometers to the east of Gordion. So you're seeing Gordion at the left and the tumulus in question at the right. There were several attempts to rob this over time, and the robbers are very clever. So here's the tumulus. It's a giant tumulus. Here's the entrance that the robbers created. They even gave themselves a little canopy, a little roof moving into the tunnel. Here you see our assistant director, Aisha Saltzman, going into the robbers' tunnel. So they're building big tunnels, really quite large. And at the end of the tunnel, they dug this last year, you see these rubble walls, or this conglomeration of rubble. That means they're in the vicinity of the tomb chamber. So we got there just in time to stop them. But there are a lot of robbers all over the place. One of the great things about Turkey is that the economy is booming, and they're building 4-lane roads all over the country. One of the bad things about Turkey is that they're building 4-lane roads all over the country, and therefore there are bulldozers all over the country. And the bulldozers can be procured, in some cases, by the looters at night to claw away at these tumuli, where they hope they will reach the burial chamber and they will find something of value that they can then sell onto the art market. So the Ankara Museum decided, after another attempt at robbery this summer, there was another robbery attempt in February, and then again at the beginning of the summer, so they decided to conduct a rescue excavation here. And with a tumulus this big, it's hard to know where to start. So what we did was to go in and do electric resistivity. You're seeing an aerial view of the tumulus here. Here are the resistivity lines that we laid down. and you see resistivity in operation here. That will only give you a cross-section of an area, but it will enable you to see down, as it were, 8 or 9 or 10 meters. And magnetometry, magnetic perspection, will only enable you to see down 2 to 3 meters. So it gives you much greater resolution. We did 4 across the top, and we were able to identify the location of the tomb chamber and to show the Ankara Museum exactly where to dig, because you don't want to waste any time here. It's enormously time-consuming, and because of the size of this tumulus, which we think is about the time of Midas, so 700 BC, there was the potential for a rich set of discoveries. And you may be wondering how I'm able to do all of these aerial photographs. It's a lot easier now than it used to be because of hexacopters. So you put a camera on a machine that has 6 propellers and send it up in the air with a remote control. And depending upon how windy it is, it will go right up and will take your aerial photographs for you. So you don't have to use hot air balloons anymore, which is what we used to have to use in the old days. It's much faster and much more efficient and much cheaper than ever before. There was a great deal of research that we also were involved in, and this involved many of the grad students in Mediterranean archaeology at Penn. You see here Sam Holtzman, one of our grad students in Mediterranean archaeology, the AAMW program, working on the tortoiseshell sound box of a lyre, Phrygian lyre. Here, you see him drawing it here. And this is the sort of thing you have to imagine. This is a later lyre. This is about 400 BC. This is about 700 BC, so this is 300 years later. But it's the same general idea. This is in the British Museum, probably from Athens. And that one, of course, is probably from Gordion. And you all perhaps are aware of the Phrygian mode in music, which is a very elaborate, animated mode. Some have compared it to gypsy music and flamenco. And so we're especially happy to have found something, and we found this by accident in one of the old storerooms, but something that gives us a sense as to how those rhythms would have been created. And recently we've also done work on the textiles that were rescued from one of the major buildings that had been destroyed in the fire of 800 BC. These textiles were excavated in so-called Megaron III and then brought back to the museum. And because so much was happening in terms of the archaeology of the site, they were put to the side, which is another problem with archaeologists. Often our eyes are bigger than our stomach, and we bite off more than we can chew, as it were. So they were put to the side rather than having been conserved immediately. And it's only this year that we've started intensive conservation of this particular group of textiles. And you see here Nancy Love, our conservator of the textiles, working with Mediterranean archaeology graduate student Kate Morgan. And they've really turned a clump of seemingly charred and black textiles into miraculous creations. So you're seeing here an example of the kinds of magnificent tapestries and textiles that the Phrygians were renowned for having created in the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th centuries BC. The word in Latin for embroiderer is frigio. It is a testament to the skill with which the Phrygians were regarded as having excelled in embroidery and in textile production. Of course, we were fortunate in having a number of high-profile visitors this summer, starting with our director, Julian Siggers, and Charles Williams, whom you see in upper left. And we were inspected 3 times, not 1, not 2, but 3 times, by officials from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Ankara, which certainly kept us on our toes. And we even received a visit from the Director General of Antiquities, Abdullah Kocapinar. You see the so-called Midas Mound in the distance, with his associates from the Ministry of Culture, and we got a gold star each time they came. But it did keep us on our toes. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we're trying to do is put Gordion more on the map. We're a little removed from the major tourist sites of Turkey. We're not Troy, we're not Aphrodisias, we're not Ephesus. The only people who come to Gordion are those who are following in the footsteps of Alexander or who have a passion for the Phrygians. So we're reaching out to the unions of tour guides, trying to give them lectures so that they'll understand how they can teach the site. Because it's not an easy site, as you will have seen, to teach. This is as far as I can take you in a 30-minute lecture But I hope you've gotten an idea of what we're trying to do with the assistance of all of these people and foundations whose names appear on the screen and for whom we're very grateful, which is to balance excavation, conservation, and publication, bringing them all together and using the most up-to-date tools and techniques we have at our disposal to create a comprehensive, the kind of comprehensive diachronic analysis of the settlements of Gordion, of which I hope even Rodney Young would have been proud. So thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for your support of the museum.